May 1945 marked the absolute collapse of Germany's air power. Almost overnight, the skies over Europe fell silent. What had once been one of the most feared air forces in the world ceased to exist as an organized fighting machine. Across the continent, thousands of German aircraft stood motionless on broken runways, hidden in forests, packed into hangars, or abandoned in fields. Fighters, bombers, transport planes, experimental jets, and unfinished prototypes were scattered from Scandinavia to the Alps. Some were untouched. Others were burned, damaged, or stripped for parts. All of them were now trophies of a war that had just ended. When the German surrender took effect, the collapse of the Air Force was already complete. For weeks before capitulation, fuel shortages had grounded many squadrons. Command structures had disintegrated under constant bombing and rapid territorial losses. Airfields no longer received clear orders. Maintenance crews were scattered or missing. Pilots had no fuel, no spare parts, and no missions. By the time the final orders came on May 8th, thousands of aircraft remained exactly where they had last been parked, silent witnesses to the destruction of a once dominant military force. In northern Germany, entire airfields were found filled with rows of aircraft in various states of readiness. Some machines still carried full markings and intact weapon systems. Others were missing engines, propellers, or cockpit instruments, removed during desperate attempts to keep a handful of planes operational during the final weeks. In Central Europe, hangars stood packed with late-war fighters and bombers that had never flown a single combat mission. In the East, factories contained half-built airframes, frozen in time as workers fled approaching armies. What surprised many Allied officers was not just the number of aircraft, but the diversity. They encountered early war designs still in storage, frontline combat aircraft from the mid-war period, and advanced late-war machines that were unlike anything the Allies had seen before. Jet-powered aircraft, rocket-driven interceptors, and radical experimental designs lay side by side with outdated trainer and cargo planes. It was as if multiple generations of aviation technology had been abandoned all at once. At major testing and research centers, Allied teams uncovered wind tunnel models, technical blueprints, prototype engines, and classified reports outlining years of secret development. These discoveries revealed how far German aviation research had progressed under the pressure of total war. High-speed aerodynamics, jet propulsion systems, advanced navigation equipment, and new weapons were no longer theoretical ideas. They existed in metal and wiring, sitting on cracked concrete runways behind barbed wire fences. Yet despite this technological progress, the reality on the ground was chaos. The Air Force no longer functioned as a unified organization. Senior officers surrendered to whichever Allied unit they encountered first. Ground crews abandoned stations without instructions. Record rooms were burned or looted. Fuel depots were empty. Spare parts warehouses had either been bombed or stripped during frantic last-minute withdrawals. The machines themselves remained, but the system that once gave them purpose had vanished. Within days of the surrender, the occupying powers imposed strict controls. All German aircraft were officially grounded. No pilot was permitted to fly without direct Allied authorization. These rules were created to prevent escape attempts, unauthorized flights, or the movement of high-ranking personnel using hidden airstrips. There was also fear that scattered units might attempt to reorganize in remote regions. Although this never truly materialized, the concern shaped early occupation policy. Almost immediately, a debate began among Allied commanders and intelligence officers. Some believed that the remaining aircraft should be destroyed as quickly as possible to eliminate any future military threat. Others argued that the machines represented a priceless source of research data. Years of enemy development could be captured without the cost of experimentation. The question was no longer whether the aircraft would be seized, but what their final destiny would be. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies moved fast. Even before the war officially ended, small teams had already begun tracking down locations rumored to house advanced aircraft. As surrender approached, these efforts expanded into full-scale recovery operations. Specialized units were formed with a clear mission: find the most advanced machines, seize all technical documentation, and secure key personnel before anyone else could reach them. The first priority was speed. With frontline boundaries shifting daily, the race to capture technology became a silent competition between former allies who already suspected that the post-war world would not remain united for long. Airfields changed hands with little warning. Factories were secured only to be transferred days later. Rail lines were either destroyed or placed under strict military guard. Every discovery carried strategic value far beyond the immediate aftermath of the war. At one airfield after another, Allied teams encountered scenes that looked more like abandoned museums than active military bases. Jet aircraft sat with protective covers still in place. Bombers with empty fuel tanks lined the edges of runways. Experimental machines, never fully approved for combat, were parked beside outdated training planes. Some pilots had left personal belongings in cockpit compartments: maps, gloves, notes, never expecting that the aircraft would be their last. Fuel shortages had played a critical role in this outcome. In the final months of fighting, fuel production had collapsed under relentless bombardment. Many squadrons received so little gasoline that pilots were ordered to save their final reserves for emergency defense only. Training flights stopped entirely. Long-distance relocations became impossible. As Allied forces advanced, entire groups of aircraft were simply left behind, unable to fly even if their crews wished to escape. Communications failure further accelerated the breakdown. Telephone lines were severed. Radio networks were overloaded or destroyed. Orders came too late or not at all. Some commanders attempted to move their aircraft to new locations, while others received contradictory instructions to hold position. The result was a patchwork of abandoned airbases filled with machines that no longer had a chain of command. While the war had ended on paper, a new conflict quietly began across these runways and hangars. This was not a battle fought with weapons, but with engineers, intelligence officers, and transport specialists. The goal was not destruction, but acquisition. Every advanced engine, every test report, and every experimental airframe represented a potential leap forward in future military technology. Yet at this early stage, the fate of most of these aircraft was still uncertain. No one yet knew how many would be preserved, how many would be dismantled for scrap, and how many would disappear forever under orders aimed at preventing any future revival. What was already clear, however, was that the vast aviation empire built by Germany during the war had ended not in one dramatic explosion, but in silence. The war in the air had concluded not with a final decisive battle, but with thousands of grounded machines left exactly where time stopped for them. Their metal skins still reflected the cold light of spring. Their engines remained cold. Their crews were gone. And their future, whether as research subjects, museum relics, recycled metal, or forgotten wrecks, was now in the hands of the victors. With Germany defeated, the battlefield transformed overnight into a massive open archive of military technology. What had once been guarded by secrecy, camouflage, and armed patrols now lay exposed across airfields, underground factories, and shattered research centers. But the end of the war did not bring rest to these machines. Instead, it triggered one of the largest technology recovery operations in modern history. What followed was not random salvaging. It was a deliberate, carefully organized international race. Within hours of the German surrender, Allied intelligence units were already on the move. Their task was simple in wording, but enormous in scale. Locate advanced aircraft, secure all technical documentation, and extract anything that could shape the future of aviation. Speed was everything. Each power understood that whoever controlled the most advanced designs would gain a strategic edge in the post-war world. American recovery teams mobilized first. Specially trained units swept through southern Germany, Austria, and parts of Central Europe. Their instructions were precise: identify jet aircraft, experimental fighters, rocket projects, and long-range bombers. Each airfield was treated as both a military site and a scientific treasure trove. Engineers worked beside armed soldiers as hangars were opened, crates were inspected, and documents were sealed for transport. Entire squadrons of captured aircraft were prepared for test evaluation. Some were repaired on site and flown under strict supervision. Others were dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto trucks, and shipped across the Atlantic. Specialized air bases in the United States became testing grounds where foreign machines were pushed to their limits under controlled conditions. Test pilots wrote detailed reports on speed, handling, climb performance, and structural weaknesses. Their findings reshaped Western understanding of jet flight within months. At the same time, Britain launched its own parallel program. The British approach differed in one crucial way. While they also sought machines, they placed equal importance on people. Engineers, designers, and technical specialists were considered just as valuable as the aircraft themselves. Teams moved rapidly through occupied zones, locating key personnel tied to jet engines, aerospace materials, radar systems, and weapons integration. Many of these specialists were offered contracts to continue working under Allied supervision. Others were questioned extensively before being transferred to research facilities abroad. Experimental aircraft were flown at British test centers, where pilots analyzed their strengths and structural flaws. Some designs impressed with raw speed but revealed poor reliability. Others proved dangerously unstable under certain flight conditions. Every discovery contributed to shaping new post-war aircraft philosophies. Further east, another massive effort unfolded. Soviet trophy units advanced behind the main armies, tasked with claiming industrial equipment, airframes, and entire factories. Their methods were direct and highly systematic. Production, faction lines were dismantled. Machine tools were loaded onto railcars. Engineers and skilled workers were relocated along with their equipment. What could not be transported was documented in detail and often destroyed. Complete aircraft were shipped eastward for evaluation. Jet engines were stripped down to their smallest components. Aerodynamic layouts were copied and compared. Though public acknowledgement came much later, these captured technologies played a decisive role in accelerating early jet development behind the Iron Curtain. As the recovery operations expanded, areas of overlap began to appear. In central regions where different Allied forces arrived only days apart, disputes emerged over who had the right to seize specific prototypes. Some aircraft were claimed, lost, relocated, and claimed again. Agreements were drafted to regulate access, but political tension already influenced decisions on the ground. Cooperation still existed, but it was fragile. Local German personnel soon became an essential part of these efforts. Former pilots provided insight into operational limits. Mechanics explained maintenance procedures. Engineers clarified design shortcuts used to compensate for material shortages during the final years of war. Their cooperation was not always voluntary, but their expertise proved critical. Without their input, many advanced systems would have remained incomplete puzzles. Every successful capture generated a flood of documentation. Photographs recorded cockpit layouts, engine mounts, weapon placements, and structural cross-sections. Blueprints were translated and duplicated. Test logs and maintenance manuals were studied line by line. This information moved rapidly between research centers and intelligence agencies, forming the foundation of post-war aerospace development. Yet for all the prized discoveries, a far greater number of aircraft were considered technically outdated or strategically insignificant. These machines filled airfields by the thousands. Fighters with worn engines, bombers missing essential equipment, trainers stripped of instruments. Their future would soon be sealed by occupation policy. By late 1945, a clear directive: Germany would retain no military air capability. The most advanced examples had already been transferred abroad. Everything else was to be eliminated. The dismantling of the remaining air fleet became one of the largest disposal operations ever conducted. Airfields transformed into industrial scrapyards. Wing after wing of aircraft was dragged into rows. Engines were extracted. Instruments were removed. Aluminum skins were cut open. Burn pits were dug for components that could not be reused. In coastal regions, some airframes were pushed onto barges and dumped into the sea. Inland, others were crushed into compressed metal blocks. The process extended across multiple countries. Squadrons that had once terrorized the skies were reduced to raw material for reconstruction. The metal fed factories that produced tools, trains, bridges, and consumer goods needed to rebuild a shattered Europe. For local civilians, the dismantling provided employment at a time when economic survival depended on any available work. Certain aircraft types sparked debate. Some transports and utility planes could theoretically serve civilian roles. In a few cases, limited numbers were converted into cargo aircraft or short-range passenger planes. But even these exceptions were temporary. Spare parts became difficult to source. Maintenance grew increasingly costly. One by one, they too vanished into scrapyards. Not everyone agreed with the scale of destruction. A small number of historians and aviation specialists later argued that unique prototypes were lost forever during this phase. There were no large museums prepared to house thousands of machines. Preservation was not a priority in a continent struggling with homelessness, food shortages, and economic collapse. The mindset of the time favored erasure over remembrance. By 1948, the great majority of Germany's wartime aircraft no longer existed. The airfields that had once housed entire wings of fighters and bombers took on new roles. Some became training bases for occupation forces. Others were converted into civilian airports. Many were simply abandoned and gradually returned to farmland or forest. And yet, the story did not end entirely with destruction. A small number of aircraft escaped the cutting torches and scrap bins. In certain regions, factories still contained half-completed airframes that were quietly finished under new national markings. Short-lived post-war air forces flew these machines out of necessity rather than choice. Their service lives were brief, but historically significant. These surviving aircraft would soon carry a strange burden. Built for one lost war, they would now fly in a reshaped world under unfamiliar flags. Their presence marked a transitional moment between destruction and renewal, a brief window where yesterday's weapons helped build tomorrow's aviation. And it is there, in that fragile post-war transition, that the next chapter of this story truly begins. When the smoke of war finally lifted, not every German aircraft vanished into scrapyards. A narrow group of machines escaped destruction, some by chance, others by deliberate decision. These survivors entered an unusual second chapter of existence, flying not for the collapsing Reich, but for nations rebuilding their own air forces in an uncertain post-war world. Their service was brief, often troubled, yet deeply symbolic of how quickly enemies could become tools of necessity. In Central Europe, several manufacturing centers emerged from the war with aircraft still on assembly lines. In workshops where bomb damage had fallen short of total destruction, engineers quietly returned to unfinished frames. With access to stored components, they began completing fighters originally intended for the Luftwaffe. These aircraft were stripped of their original markings and repainted under new national roundels. Though built for one purpose, they were now pressed into service under radically different political systems. One of the most unusual outcomes emerged from post-war Czechoslovakia. Using leftover components and modified engines, local engineers assembled a hybrid fighter that bore the outward appearance of a wartime interceptor but handled far differently in the air. The resulting aircraft gained a reputation for being difficult to control, with temperamental behavior during takeoff and landing. Yet it filled a desperate need at a moment when few alternatives existed. For several years, it formed the backbone of local air defense until more modern Soviet aircraft replaced it. Some of those same fighters took part in an even stranger episode of aviation history. In the late 1940s, a newly established Middle Eastern Air Force found itself urgently in need of combat aircraft. Traditional suppliers hesitated, blocked by international restrictions and political pressure. The only viable option came from surplus European stocks. A small number of these reassembled German-derived fighters were quietly transferred abroad. Though flawed and outmatched by newer designs, they became the first combat aircraft of that young nation's air arm and played a role far larger than their limited performance should have allowed. Meanwhile, in southwestern Europe, a different path unfolded. Under licensing agreements that predated the war's end, Spanish factories continued producing a redeveloped version of a German fighter design. These aircraft retained the distinctive profile of their wartime ancestor, but were fitted with locally produced engines and revised systems. They served for over a decade in training and secondary combat roles long after their original German counterparts had disappeared. Decades later, many of these aircraft would gain a second fame of their own, not in combat, but in cinema, portraying enemy fighters in large-scale war films. Northern Europe also experimented with limited post-war operations using captured machines. In Norway, a handful of seized aircraft were operated briefly during the difficult transition from occupation to independence. Spare parts proved nearly impossible to maintain. Engines wore out, instruments failed. Over time, they were grounded one by one. Some were cannibalized to keep others flying. A few airframes survived long enough to be recovered decades later for museum restoration. Elsewhere, German transport aircraft found short-term civilian roles. Rugged and dependable by the standards of the era, several were converted into passenger and cargo planes. Their spacious cabins and short-field capabilities made them useful in regions where infrastructure lagged behind recovery. In France, a rebranded variant served colonial routes for a time, carrying supplies and passengers into remote territories. Even the reborn German airline industry relied briefly on these aircraft before transitioning to newer, purpose-built designs. Yet despite these scattered revivals, the long-term future of Germany's wartime aviation heritage was sealed by geopolitical reality. When West Germany was finally permitted to rebuild its military forces in the mid-1950s, the new air arm was constructed entirely from Allied technology. Jet fighters designed in Britain and North America replaced any lingering notions of resurrecting domestic wartime types. The shift was not merely technical, it was symbolic. The new Air Force represented a break from the past, a deliberate step away from the imagery and machinery of the Third Reich. By this point, the surviving Luftwaffe aircraft had entered three separate categories: operational relics nearing retirement, static training hulks, and forgotten wrecks. Those that remained in service faded quietly from flight lines. Those in storage were eventually scrapped as maintenance costs outpaced their value. And those lost in remote forests, frozen lakes, and buried crash sites became time capsules waiting to be rediscovered. From the 1960s onward, a different movement slowly gained momentum. Aviation historians, private collectors, and museum curators began searching for what little remained of the vanished air fleet. Expeditions were launched into remote regions of Eastern Europe and northern Scandinavia. Divers descended into cold lakes. Excavation teams lifted corroded fuselages from peat bogs and forests. Each discovery became both a technical challenge and a moral reckoning with history. Restoration rarely involved a single intact aircraft. In most cases, pieces from several wrecks were combined to rebuild one display model. Sections of wings from one site were paired with engine mounts from another. Cockpits were reconstructed from fragments. Instruments were recovered, cleaned, and calibrated after decades of burial. The work took years. Some projects stretched across entire generations. Careers. By the late 20th century, only a tiny fraction of the original Luftwaffe fleet existed in museum form. A few iconic types could now be seen behind glass in aviation halls across Europe and North America. Among them were examples of the legendary jet fighter Messerschmitt Me-262 and the once mass-produced Bf-109. Their survival stood in stark contrast to the tens of thousands that had vanished without ceremony. The transformation was complete. What had once been the largest and most technologically ambitious air force in Europe now existed only as fragments. Corroded remains beneath soil, aluminum melted into post-war infrastructure, and a handful of carefully preserved exhibits. Entire production lines, once guarded under the highest secrecy, had been dismantled and scattered across competing superpowers. Ironically, the same aircraft that once symbolized domination of the skies helped fuel the next age of aviation. Data gathered from post-war testing accelerated the global transition into the jet era. Lessons drawn from German aerodynamic research influenced the development of swept-wing fighters and high-speed bombers on both sides of the emerging Cold War divide. Engines were redesigned, stability problems were corrected, material science advanced rapidly. The legacy lived on, not as a revived force, but as technical knowledge absorbed into a new global arms race. For decades, much of this story remained buried beneath political silence and scattered documentation. Only after archives opened and veterans began speaking more openly did the full scope of what happened to the Luftwaffe's machines become clear. They were not merely destroyed, they were studied, recycled, exported, forgotten, recovered, and transformed into historical artifacts. What remains today is not a fleet, but a shadow. A technical legacy stripped of its original purpose, reshaped by nations that once fought it, and preserved only in isolated fragments. These aircraft no longer represent power. They represent warning, innovation, and the speed with which even the most advanced war machines can vanish once the engines fall silent. And in the final chapter of this story, we turn to the forgotten wrecks still hidden beneath water and soil. The last undiscovered ghosts of Germany's vanished air arm. Long after the scrapyards fell silent and the last operational aircraft were grounded, the story of Germany's vanished air fleet refused to disappear. Beneath forests, frozen lakes, rivers, and remote mountain valleys, hundreds of wrecks remained hidden, untouched since the final battles of the war. These aircraft were not captured, studied, or recycled. They became time capsules, sealed by nature and forgotten by history. In Eastern Europe, advancing armies had pushed countless damaged aircraft into forests to clear runways for new operations. Some crashed during chaotic retreat flights. Others were deliberately destroyed and abandoned where they fell. Over the decades, local legends grew around these sites. Farmers spoke of metal wings beneath the soil. Fishermen reported strange shadows below the surface of cold lakes. Many of these stories were dismissed until recovery teams began confirming them. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating after the fall of the Iron Curtain, explorers and historians launched systematic searches for lost wrecks. Using archival maps, crash reports, and veteran testimonies, they traced forgotten flight paths. What they found was often heartbreaking. Corroded fuselages buried in mud, engines frozen in underwater silk, cockpits still containing faded instruments, and, in rare cases, personal belongings of pilots who never returned. Each recovery operation became more than a technical project. It was an act of remembrance. Aircraft were lifted piece by piece, restored over years, and eventually placed into museums, not as symbols of power, but as artifacts of warning. These machines no longer represented victory or defeat. They represented the consequences of industrialized war. Today, only a tiny fraction of Germany's wartime air fleet survives in any physical form. The overwhelming majority was erased between 1945 and 1948, melted down to help rebuild the very cities they once bombed or defended. Aluminum from fighters may now exist in railway bridges, factory equipment, and civilian infrastructure across Europe. In a real, physical sense, the Luftwaffe was recycled into the post-war world that replaced it. And yet, its shadow continues to influence aviation. The research captured after the war shaped jet design, aerodynamics, and engine development on both sides of the Cold War. The sky itself changed because of what was learned from those machines. The technology moved forward, but the ideology behind it was left behind. This is what makes the fate of these aircraft so powerful. They were once the cutting edge of military engineering. They were built to dominate the skies. And yet, within just a few years, they were reduced to scrap, wreckage, and museum exhibits. It shows how quickly even the most terrifying war machine can vanish once the system that created it collapses. In my personal view, this story is not just about airplanes. It's about how history strips power of its illusion of permanence. What seems unstoppable in one decade can completely disappear in the next. The Luftwaffe once ruled European skies. Today, it survives only as fragments behind museum glass and rust beneath the earth. And maybe that is exactly how it should be remembered. Not as a legend of strength, but as a reminder of how fast destruction turns into silence. If this story gave you a deeper understanding of what really happened after the war, support the channel by pressing like and subscribing. It truly helps these history projects grow. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.